When we imagine ancient Greece, our minds fill with images of enlightenment, the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western philosophy, the stage for epic poetry. We see the gleaming marble of the Parthenon and hear the echoes of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But to truly understand the fabric of this society, we must step away from the public monuments and into the private shadows, into a world where power, status, and desire shaped lives far more intensely than any philosophical ideal ever could. In the eyes of the Athenian elite, personal relationships were often less a union of hearts and more a demonstration of power. It was a world of strict hierarchies, where the lines between citizen and slave, master and servant were absolute and unyielding. Love as we perceive it was a luxury few could afford, and even fewer prioritized over influence and control. This was not a world of equals, it was a world of dominance and submission. And within this rigid system, one figure existed in a state of profound contradiction: the male concubine. His was not a story of celebrated romance or mentorship, but a life lived on the edge of a knife. His existence was a transaction, a testament to a world where a person's value was measured not by their spirit, but by their youth, their beauty, and their capacity for complete submission. This is their story. To understand the tragedy of the male concubine, we must first navigate the complex and often misunderstood landscape of relationships in ancient Greece. Much has been written about the Greek tradition of pederasty, and it is here that the line between ideal and reality becomes dangerously blurred. In its most romanticized form, this was a relationship between an older, established citizen, the Erastes, or the lover, and a freeborn teenage boy of good standing, the eromenos, or the beloved. This bond was publicly framed as a form of mentorship. The older man was expected to guide the youth, to educate him in politics, philosophy, and the duties of a citizen. It was seen, at least on the surface, as a noble institution designed to shape the next generation of Athenian leaders. But this idealized model, reserved for the sons of the privileged, hides a much broader and starker truth. For countless others, slaves captured in war, boys sold by impoverished families, or even those born into servitude, the relationship was stripped of any pretense of mentorship. They were not students, they were property. They were not protégés, they were possessions. Their role was that of a concubine, a companion whose function was brutally clear: to provide pleasure, beauty, and a living symbol of their master's wealth and status. You see, Greek society didn't judge these relationships based on modern ideas of morality. Instead, they focused entirely on power and status. What mattered was not who was involved, but who held control. The citizen, the master, was always the dominant partner, the active force. The concubine, by definition, was the passive receiver, the one who submitted. And in this submission, especially if he was a slave, he had no honor to defend and no social standing of his own. His identity was not his, it was merely a reflection of the man who owned him. So what was life like for a boy living inside this reflection, his identity entirely owned by another? From the outside, it could appear deceptively lavish, a life of privilege that other slaves and even many poor citizens could only dream of. This was the gilded cage. The gilding was the visible, material comfort. He was spared the back-breaking labor of the silver mines or the toil of the fields. He was dressed in fine linens, not coarse wool. He was anointed with expensive imported oils and perfumes. He ate from his master's table, tasting delicacies and drinking wine that was far beyond the reach of the common man. He would be a fixture at the symposium, the famed Greek drinking party, reclining on a couch beside his patron. In these moments he was a living trophy, a beautiful, silent ornament meant to inspire the envy and admiration of his master's peers. To them, he was a symbol of wealth, taste, and power. But this was not a life. It was a performance, and the pressure was immense. Every word, every gesture, every glance had to be carefully measured to please his master. A moment of defiance, a flicker of sadness, or a simple refusal could bring swift and severe consequences, for his body was not his own. It was a vessel for his patron's desires, available at any time, for any purpose. The servitude, however, went far deeper than the physical. He was expected to be an emotional caretaker, a cheerful companion when his master was joyful, a silent confidant for his master's burdens, a witty conversationalist to entertain his guests, all while viciously suppressing his own fears, sorrows, and desires. He existed in a strange and isolating social limbo. In the hierarchy of the household, he might be placed above other slaves, yet he was never their equal, often becoming a target of their resentment. He mingled with the city's elite, but could never, ever, be one of theirs. Them. He was an insider who remained perpetually on the outside, surrounded by people but fundamentally terrifyingly alone, and hanging over every luxurious meal, every shared cup of wine, was the chilling, unspoken truth. This entire existence was conditional. It was tied to one thing and one thing alone, his master's favor, a favor that was as fleeting and unpredictable as life itself. The bars of his gilded cage, though invisible, were forged from cold, hard iron. If life inside the cage was a constant performance for his master, life outside of it was a dangerous walk on a social tightrope, with no safety net below. To the public world of ancient Greece, the male concubine was a living paradox, and his master's relationship with him was a source of profound hypocrisy. In the private, masculine space of the symposium, his presence could be accepted, even celebrated, as a sign of his patron's wealth, taste, and virility. He was admired in the same way a man might admire a friend's fine horse or a beautifully crafted vase. He was an object, a luxurious possession that affirmed his owner's status among his peers. But in the open air of the agora, the public square where civic life unfolded, he was less than a man. The very passivity and submission that defined his role were seen as deeply shameful, the absolute antithesis of the Greek ideal of the dominant, self-possessed male citizen. While men might envy his master's access to such beauty, they often held the boy himself in contempt. He was the subject of crude jokes passed between citizens, of whispered insults in the market, and of moralizing lectures from philosophers who saw his existence as a symptom of societal decay. He had no real status. He could not vote, own property, or testify in court. In the eyes of the law and the public, he was all but invisible, and this invisibility was a double-edged sword. While it shielded him from some civic duties, it also made him incredibly vulnerable, a pawn in the games played by powerful men. He was a weapon that could be used against his master. If his patron became politically unpopular, the relationship could be twisted into a scandal. The master could be publicly accused of being overly indulgent, effeminate, and controlled by his passions, a fatal character flaw for any man aspiring to leadership. And in the brutal arena of Athenian politics, the quickest way to neutralize such an attack was to eliminate its source. The concubine would be the first sacrifice. He could be sold to a foreign land, exiled from the city, or quietly killed, his entire existence erased to protect his master's reputation. He learned a terrifying lesson on this tightrope. His life was an asset only as long as it brought his master pleasure and prestige. The moment it became a liability, it was worthless. For every boy walking this tightrope, the greatest liability was not politics or scandal. It was something far more simple and far more cruel: the passage of time. Youth was his only currency, beauty his only shield, and both were fleeting. With each passing year, the smooth skin would begin to line, the youthful glow would start to dim. The boy who was once the centerpiece of every conversation, the object of every admiring glance, would slowly begin to fade into the background. His patron's gaze, which once held a possessive fire, would now pass over him with indifference, or worse, with impatience. A younger, fresher face would appear at the symposium, reclining in the place of honor he once occupied. The kind words would become infrequent, then cease altogether. The shared moments would be replaced by a cold, silent distance. And then, the day he always feared would inevitably arrive. The favor was gone. What happened to him then? The historical record is mostly silent, for the discarded are rarely given a voice. Was he simply cast out onto the brutal streets of Athens, with no skills, no name, and no way to survive, left to beg or starve? Was he sold to a harsher master, perhaps to labor in the suffocating darkness of the silver mines, his days of comfort now a torturous, mocking memory? Or was he sold to a brothel, his body, once a private treasure, now made a public commodity? Perhaps the most common, and in some ways most heartless fate came when his master decided to take a wife and produce a legitimate heir. To build a respectable household for a new bride, the relics of a less respectable past had to be swept away. The boy was an inconvenience, a living reminder of a life the patron now needed to forget. He was not just discarded, he was erased. This was the ultimate tragedy of the gilded cage. There was no graceful exit. There was no pension for his years of service. His entire world, a world built on the fleeting affection of a single powerful man, could be dismantled in a single day by a single decision. He had given his youth, his body, and his identity, and in the end, he was left with absolutely nothing. When the Roman Emperor Hadrian lost his beloved Antinous, he defied tradition. He immortalized the boy, building a city in his name, carving his face onto countless statues and declaring him a god. His grief reshaped the landscape of the empire. For the Greek concubine, there was no such legacy. There was only silence. Their names are not recorded in the grand histories of Herodotus or Thucydides. They were not the subjects of epic poems or the heroes of tragic plays. If they appear at all, it is as nameless figures in the background, a punchline in a bawdy comedy by Aristophanes, or a brief, dismissive example in a philosopher's dialogue on the dangers of decadence and passion. History, after all, is the story told by the powerful. It remembers the masters, the citizens, the conquerors. It has little time and even less ink for the beautiful boys who served them, whose only legacy was to be completely and utterly forgotten. The story of the male concubine, from the gilded cage to the social tightrope, from a master's fleeting favor to a final silent erasure, is more than just a tale of personal tragedy. It is a stark and uncomfortable lens through which we must view this celebrated civilization. It reminds us that behind the gleaming ideals of democracy and philosophy often lay a foundation built on a brutal and absolute imbalance of power. His life reveals a world where personal agency was a privilege of the few, not a right of the many, where one man's desire could create another's entire reality and just as easily destroy it. The stories of these forgotten boys show us that Greek ideas of love, status, and freedom were as complex and as fraught with contradiction as the society itself. They are a haunting reminder that for every great name history chooses to remember, there are countless others, silenced and forgotten, whose lives formed the invisible scaffolding of that greatness.